China achieved incredible things, but eventually you need democratic control from below, from the working class.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
Communism.
The communism.
The communist. The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what
Welcome
is
to the
communism?
Spectre of Communism. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 is regarded by Marxists as the second greatest event in human history after the Russian Revolution. By the same token, the Chinese Revolution haunts the nightmares of the bourgeois and their apologists. I have here an article by Lee Edwards, PhD, described as a former distinguished fellow in conservative thoughts and a leading historian of American conservatism, editor of 25 books and writer of many others. And he writes an article for the Heritage Foundation called "The Legacy of Mao Zedong is Mass Murder." Opens as follows. Can you name the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century? No, it wasn't Hitler or Stalin, it was Mao Zedong. According to the authoritative Black Book of Communism, an estimated 65 million Chinese died as a result of Mao's repeated, merciless attempts to create a new socialist China. That's in inverted commas. Anyone who got in his way was done away with by execution, imprisonments, or forced famine. And the article ends, I wonder, would the president be so ready to kowtow to China if in the middle of Beijing there was a mausoleum of Hitler and hanging from the gate of the Forbidden City, a giant swastika? Now, it's true that the legacy of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution is complex, and to help us unpick fact from fiction, we have Daniel Morley, who is a member of the Executive Committee of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain. Daniel, thanks for coming on.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you've written a lot about China, about its history, and the first thing that I want to establish is what's the attitude of genuine Marxists, genuine communists towards the Chinese Revolution of 1949?
Well, you sort of summarized it at the beginning, which is that it was an extraordinary event in human history in which hundreds of millions of people were liberated from imperialist domination, which they had faced. You know, they call it the century of humiliation, basically from the Opium Wars in the 1840s through to the revolution. And talking of famines, many famines took place during that century of humiliation, and China became one of the poorest countries in the world, whereas it had previously been one of the most developed. And the revolution freed it from that domination. And actually, under Mao, under the regime that was established, there was enormous economic growth, which is not actually discussed or mentioned at all. We hear about the growth after Mao, which is also true, but there was enormous economic growth thanks to the abolishing of capitalism, which was, Chinese capitalism was phenomenally corrupt and unproductive. You had an enormous growth of about 10% a year. You had a huge life expectancy went from something like 35, 36 years old to about 70 years old in a couple of decades. You had the widespread brutal oppression of women brought to an end in the sense of foot binding becoming abolished. The sale of women was abolished. Women entered the workforce in a big way. You had a massive program of house building, of social house building, and big improvements in workers' rights and conditions. And so they achieved actually quite incredible things. That's not to say that there weren't massive problems and things that we completely disagree with, which we can discuss. But we have to start out by acknowledging where China came from and what the revolution actually achieved. And of course, China would not have the position it has today were it not for the Chinese state being freed from Western domination.
I have a quote here written by Ted Grants just before Mao and his Red Army accomplished their final victory over Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Chinese capitalists, the Chinese bourgeois, which I think summarizes our attitude pretty well. So Ted Grant is the founding theoretician of the organization that became the Revolutionary Communist International. And he writes, in January 1949, Every socialist worker will wholeheartedly applaud the destruction of feudalism and of large-scale capitalism in this important section of Asia, even though it is carried out under the leadership of Stalinism. In its long-term implications, it is as important as the October Revolution itself. And that's a really prescient quote, because actually it was written before Mao expropriated capitalism, before the big transformation of Chinese society that occurred under his regime. And it also captures the balanced attitude that we have towards Mao and his legacy and towards Chinese revolution, because much in the same way that we applaud the amazing accomplishments of the Soviet Union on the basis of the planned economy, and they were enormous accomplishments, we also don't deny that there was terrible waste, awful repression, and a complete distortion of the genuine principles of Marxism, of communism. So yeah, it's a complex legacy, and we're going to deal with its history, and we're going to deal with a bit of the background, a bit of the run-up to 1949. And I think that we should start with a different revolution, a failed revolution, that of 1927, because this was a really important turning point, not just in Chinese history, but I would say for the history of the world class struggle, for the world revolution, and also for the Russian Revolution, because there was a reverberating impact from the disastrous outcome of this uprising in 1927. So Daniel, could you give us a bit of a background to the Revolution of 27 and what it meant?
Well, yeah, the revolution of it really started in 1925 and then ended in 1927, and that was in truth, a working class led revolution, despite the fact that the Chinese working class was only about 10 or at most 20 years old and very small in number. But they were in the big cities like Shanghai and what was called at the time, at least in the West, Canton or Guangzhou. They led the revolution, right? And they even occupied and ran those cities under workers' control for a period of time. Demonstrating extraordinary degrees of organization and class consciousness. And the Chinese Communist Party was also therefore thrust into the leadership of the movement. It was founded in 1921, so only 4 years before those events started, which is incredible. And that tells you so much about the world situation and the fact that the world was ripe for socialist revolution, even if individual countries like China didn't have the material prerequisites to build a socialist society because they were largely rural economies. But it's much more complex than that. The countries of the world at that time couldn't just be taken on their own and looked at as if that was all that counted for them. They were part of the world, right? So yes, China's economy was in the main quite backwards and rural, but it was dominated by imperialism, by British and French and American imperialism, which had carved out for itself parts of the country. That's why you had Hong Kong for a while as a British possession. And they brought capitalism to China, and they molded basically the Chinese ruling class at the time, which was a pre-capitalist class, although there were capitalist tendencies, I suppose. But they molded it into a capitalist class, but a very corrupt and dependent one, one with no independence from imperialism, no real kind of productive base, basically. They were like kind of middlemen. And then, but that nevertheless introduced capitalist relations and interests into China. And that was also why you had this very sort of intensely sort of fast-track development of a working class in these cities. And that working class was politically kind of also fast-tracked in its development by the World Revolution, right? i.e. by particularly the Russian Revolution and then the creation of the Communist International. And that had an enormous impact on the consciousness of Chinese people. And we have to realize these people have been humiliated by imperialism and impoverished. And then they see this revolution on their borders, effectively, in Russia, which overthrew imperialism and overthrew capitalism, and the very people who were oppressing China were overthrown. And then actually the Russian Revolution actually gave back to China possessions, essentially, that Tsarist Russia had extracted from China in an exploitative fashion. They voluntarily gave back to China. Imagine the effect that would have on the consciousness of radicalized young Chinese people. It was enormously influential. So you had this creation of the Chinese Communist Party, actually, but even before the trade unions were created. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party created the trade unions of China. And so, whereas in a country like Britain, the working class had a very drawn out political development, it took a long time for trade unions really to develop, and much longer still until a mass working class party was created. And even that was not really, it was not a revolutionary party, it was the Labour Party. In China, in a matter of, a handful of years, you have the creation of a communist party with links to a communist international that was in power in Russia. And that's why you see, when the revolution breaks out in 1925, extraordinary degree of class consciousness and organization from the Chinese workers. And, I don't have time to go into the events, but basically it happened because of a number of things took place where colonial authorities and police basically shot dead students and other protesters and striking workers in, foreign-owned factories and Japanese and I think British factories, and that sparked waves of strikes and student protests across the country, which culminated in, as I said, workers taking over and running Canton and Shanghai, like under workers' control. Basically, the workers took over those cities, a bit like the Paris Commune. So that's, it was an incredibly powerful revolution. However, the Communist Party was very dependent upon Moscow for leadership, for ideas, because it was so new. And Moscow, under Stalin's leadership at that time, unfortunately, Stalin had basically just taken over the Communist Party, Communist International, and he had no confidence in the Chinese working class, right? His outlook was already, that of, as he could put it, socialism in one country. It was a conservative outlook, a cautious one, a bureaucratic outlook, basically. He reflected the interests of the sort of emerging Soviet bureaucracy, who wanted really to put an end to the storm and stress of ideas of world revolution, challenging capitalist powers, that sort of thing. They wanted to come to deals, really, with capitalist powers. They want to be treated as equals on the diplomatic arena with bourgeois diplomats, and strike trade deals and such with Western powers. That was really their outlook. So it was a very cautious one. And from their point of view, China was a colonial country with a tiny, brand new working class. And in the outlook of a bureaucrat, bureaucrats never have confidence in the working class, really. Like they want to do backroom deals. They see the intervention of workers as a sort of unplanned, chaotic, untrustworthy thing. But also, much less would they have confidence of the working class of a different country, from a completely different culture, from an Asian culture, with no existing traditions of working class organisation. So I think in their mentality, it was ridiculous that the Chinese workers could possibly come to power. They just didn't take it seriously at all. They didn't really have any interest in the real dynamics of the Chinese revolution. They didn't really examine the class forces. They didn't look at who had what interests. And so Stalin basically ordered that the Communist Party of China, against actually the instincts of its leaders, by the way, he ordered them to ally with and subordinate themselves to the Kuomintang, which was the new bourgeois nationalist party, which was allegedly a revolutionary, but a kind of bourgeois revolutionary party, anti-imperialist party, but not socialist, and they were like, well, that's much more realistic. They're the people, that's who's going to come to power. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of that party, that's a realistic, a responsible sort of statesman. And
in typical Stalinist bureaucratic fashion, they post facto developed a theoretical justification for that turn with the theory of stages, which we dealt with in other episodes, but basically the idea that because China hadn't attained its capitalist revolution, it was necessary for the bourgeois to lead, and therefore the role of the working class should be to support the bourgeois capitalist Kuomintang, because after then it would be the workers' turn. This was actually a reheated Menshevik idea. This was the attitude that the reformist wing of the Russian Marxist Party had towards the bourgeois liberals that Lenin had polemicized against all the way back to the early 1900s.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's and again, the stagism, it's such a bureaucratic sort of idea of things, isn't it? That, there's a formula and a kind of step-by-step process. Of course, countries obey laws, right? Revolutions don't just happen based on willpower or something, but They are much more complicated than that. And as I said, the world, the existence of imperialism in the early 20th century meant that the development of countries like China, the social and political development of countries like China, was just very different to what it was for countries like England and France when they had their bourgeois revolutions, because they weren't, England and France were not, their capitalism was completely homegrown, and you had an indigenous revolutionary bourgeois class. But that wasn't the case for China. The Chinese capitalist class was conservative. It was linked to and dependent on foreign imperialism, which didn't want a revolution at all, didn't trust, especially when there was a Communist Party involved. They were, the world imperialists, like the British and Americans, were obviously very fearful of the Communist International, and they saw a rising revolution in China, a Communist Party involved. They never would have backed that. So they basically backed Chiang Kai-shek. So you had, ironically, kind of two sides of society backing Chiang Kai-shek.
And we'll go into more detail about Chiang Kai-shek later, but he's the leader of the Kuomintang.
Yeah, would-be dictator. So he's backed by both the Western imperialists and Chinese capitalists, who see him as a strong man who can put an end to the nonsense of strikes and working class organization, but also, ironically, by the Communist Party, because the Stalinists thought, he's a realistic anti-imperialist, even though he was not really. He made anti-imperialist noises, right? But it was clear that he was actually, to a certain extent, paid for and in the pockets of American imperialism.
And invited as a special guest to the Comintern.
Yeah, ridiculously. To the Comintern Executive Committee, I believe.
So we've got lots of material about the Revolution of 27, but just to cut a long story short, how does this alliance between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang actually turn out? Yeah,
it turns out exactly as Trotsky was warning, which is that when his positions were, when he had all his pieces in place, Chiang Kai-shek not once but twice staged coups against the Communist Party, against the workers. So first in Canton and then in Shanghai. And when he did it in Shanghai, there was no warning by the Communist Party, by the leadership, by Moscow, even though they'd seen him do it in Canton. So he basically he was in alliance with the Communist Party, but he just turned around and overnight organised a coup, got his military people in all the right places, arrested the communists and massacred them, just absolutely massacred them.
And let's talk about the impact of that massacre on the flower of the Chinese proletariat, its most advanced and developed elements. There's a report that was sent to the third plenum of the Communist Party in September 1930 that says, though there are 120,000 party members, the industrial worker members only number a little more than 2,000. So the consequence, 27, was that the Communist Party was effectively cut off from the industrial proletariat in China.
Yeah. I mean, the defeat was very bad, and it didn't have to be that way. We can't know exactly how things would have played out had they followed Trotsky's advice or their own instincts, which were basically in line with Trotsky's. There certainly wouldn't have been anything like that. So Chiang Kai-shek was able to sort of take power quite easily because the Communist Party was not at all prepared for it. In fact, had even handed over to him lists of their own members, which he demanded as a part of the deal of allying with them. And Stalin said, yes, you must do this, because otherwise he won't ally with you. So they gave him the names and addresses of their members. So they were massacred, obviously, like thousands and thousands of them in Shanghai and Canton were killed. That was bad enough. But what really compounded that defeat was that instead of drawing the obvious conclusions and retreating and going into hiding in the cities, going underground, a bit like after 1905, perhaps in Russia, and then in a clandestine way rebuilding the party, rebuilding its links to the workers. Instead of doing that, and that would mean acknowledging that the revolution had been lost.
And Trotsky had a point.
Yeah, and that they had been wrong about Chiang Kai-shek, obviously. But basically, Stalin could not, because in Russia at the time, there was this dispute between Trotsky and Stalin over the character of the Chinese Revolution. That became a key part of the revolution, of the struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. It was very prominent. It wasn't like an obscure debate. So obviously, what happened basically just completely proved Trotsky right, which was very embarrassing for Stalin. So he couldn't admit that. He couldn't say, oh, yes, Chiang Kai-shek's turned out to be a traitor, counter-revolutionary. That would be tacit, even if he didn't say Trotsky's name, that would be tacit admission that Trotsky was right. His struggle with Trotsky was by no means over in 1927. It wasn't, okay, he was in power and Trotsky wasn't, but Trotsky was still in the country, he was still in the Communist Party. So that would have been very difficult for him. So he basically denied that anything had changed. In fact, what he said is, "Oh, no, we knew this all along. Actually, we're now moved to a different phase of the revolution in which Chiang Kai-shek has exposed himself, which we knew and had prepared for. This means that the revolution is now advancing to a more revolutionary stage, to a proletarian stage. And so we dispense with Chiang Kai-shek. He's no longer our ally. And this was all foreseen. And now what that means is that the Communist Party must go on the offensive because we're now in the true revolutionary phase, which he just made up, essentially. This was just made up to justify, to save face. And so what that meant is that in Canton and then in subsequently in other places, this defeated and demoralized Communist Party was ordered to stage an uprising out of the blue and basically conquer power in those places, which is deeply ironic because they actually had power in Canton about a year previously, and then Chiang Kai-shek had his coup, which they were unprepared for. So they actually had the thing that they were now trying to conjure up artificially. But this time they did it with about 300 members rather than the thousands of workers who were doing it anyway in 1926. So they stormed various places like post offices and city municipal authority buildings, things like that, and sort of hoisted the red flag and declared, "Oh, this is the Canton Commune," and the workers, who of course had just witnessed a bloodbath of their best activists being massacred by Chiang Kai-shek, were not exactly in a state of enthusiasm, but they were just confused. They hadn't been involved in the planning of this, and they wouldn't have supported it, I don't think, anyway, even if they had been. And so they didn't come to the aid of this at all. They just were passive and stayed at home for fear of their lives, probably. And so it was very easy for Chiang Kai-shek's forces to pick off these 300 or so communists, which they did. And so they then were either killed or they fled the city. And they did the same thing in other cities. So this just totally compounded the defeat. And it led to an exodus of the remaining Communist Party members into the countryside.
And that's really critical to understanding the eventual character of the peasant army that Mao bases his rise to power on. But before we talk about that, I want to talk some more about the character of the Kuomintang, the Chinese bourgeoisie, the regime that existed in China as a consequence of this defeat. What was it like? What kind of a regime are we dealing with?
Well, far from establishing an independent bourgeois progressive China, which was the stated aim under which Stalin supported Chiang Kai-shek, he completely abandoned himself to the most counter-revolutionary, reactionary, backwards forces in society and allied himself with the imperialists as well. The basis for his regime and his sort of credibility as a leader was, "I'm the man who will stamp out communism." That was when he carried out his coups in Canton and Shanghai. That was the justification for it, and he'd done that not on a whim. Obviously, he'd been having meetings with industrialists and financiers, particularly in Shanghai, and they'd backed him. They'd given him money on the understanding that he would be this strong man who would do that. And so he did, and having done that, the whole momentum of his regime was obviously in that direction. He became a classic Bonapartist leader, but a particularly corrupt one. And by Bonapartist, I mean, a dictator who, defends capitalism, defends, the market and private property, but becomes a strong man and rules by the sword because of this kind of chaos in society and this deadlock in the class struggle. That justifies the role of a strongman. So basically he says to the capitalists, look, invest colossal power in me, give me enormous authority to do whatever I want, martial law and everything, because that's what you need to stamp out this menace of communism and all these strikes and factory occupations.
It's a terrible irony, isn't it? Because the justification coming from Moscow was that Chiang was the man who was going to achieve the bourgeois revolution, which means what? You establish democracy. Well, he actually established a dictatorial Bonapartist regime. Mm-hmm. He even said that China could benefit from fascism. In 1935, he said, fascism is a stimulant for a declining society. Can fascism save China? We answer yes. Fascism is what China now most needs. I mean, for reasons we don't have time to deal with, he wasn't able to establish a truly fascist regime, but he had elements of it.
He had no support, basically.
Right,
he was very unpopular.
But, so on the question of democracy, you have this horrific dictatorial and deeply corrupt regime. You have mass executions. 140,000 were executed by 1930. In 1931 alone, there were about 40,000 executions across 6 provinces. And then another objective of the bourgeois revolution is resolving the land question. So dealing with landlordism, establishing modern relations in the countryside. But total agricultural output in China increased less than 1% in the 5-year period between 1932 and 1936. Economic growth was approximately the same in 1936 as in 32. So he utterly failed to modernize the countryside, and most of China was rural. Most Chinese people were peasants, and totally failed to develop the economy. Instead, he had a cozy relationship with the landlords. In fact, wherever he would destroy a grouping of the communists, wherever he would defeat the Reds, the peasant army, which we'll deal with later on, he goes to extraordinary lengths to give the land that was captured back to landlords. He was in a close alliance with the traditional warlords in China, who still held a lot of sway.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually. Another big aspect, a big part of the bourgeois revolution is establishing a nation state, because obviously under feudalism before in Europe, particularly with countries like Germany and Italy, the countries were divided up into all these feudal principalities. So the task was to sort of enlarge the scale of the country, basically, to sort of build a bigger country and to get rid of all these little barriers to trade. That was the bourgeoisie's task. And in China, the opposite happened. It fell back into warlordism under Chiang. The country actually kind of ceased to be a country. He was a very weak leader, despite being very authoritarian. He's very weak. There were constant rebellions by local landlords. And why is that? It's because the impetus of the revolution was smashed, right? Because the real driving force of it was the working class, and to a certain extent peasants, but it was essentially the working class. They were defeated. So local landlords and warlords obviously then had a field day, and Chiang, as you mentioned, kind of gave them their land back. The whole raison d'etre of his regime became that I'm the one who will stamp out any of this nonsense from below. And so he does that. Throughout this whole revolutionary period, really beginning of the 20th century, you have, there's a colossal crisis in the Chinese state, because the Chinese state was a very old state going back a very long time, based on a different economic foundation, a pre-capitalist foundation. And it's brought into capitalism not by some national class within China, but by foreign imperialists. So the Chinese state sort of is then propped up by imperialists, by the British and others, and I don't have time to go into that, but they prop it up. So it loses its moral kind of force and its tradition. It's been hollowed out, and the Chinese. So there isn't really much of a national Chinese state, to be honest. And you just have like local warlords essentially stepping in to secure their interests and taking advantage of the cracks and crises in society. And Chiang Kai-shek is not able to put a stop to that. In fact, it accelerates under his lead, because the whole basis of his lead is to stamp out any progressive force in society that's pulling society forwards. So yes, and he basically bases his power on these warlords, and he essentially just maneuvers between them throughout his reign. Occasionally it would happen that some of the warlords would be like, look, this guy's a joke, we're going to get rid of him. And how would he deal with that? He had no popular base. So he couldn't he couldn't say to people, oh, look, here's this corrupt reactionary warlord who wants to get rid of me. Come and fight in some great fight with me against that warlord. He couldn't say that because that would be mobilizing people from below. He didn't want to do that at all. So the only way he could stamp out these rebellions by warlords was by giving them bribes. He essentially bribed them. And you see this in many countries, this kind of these crony capitalist regimes, a very, very weak basis for them because capitalism is so weak in that country. And the basis of that regime is just, handing out bribes to like local power bases, keeping them happy for a while. And basically just looting the country in that way, not developing the economy at all, just sort of ransacking bits of the economy, bits of the state apparatus to give bribes to people and keep the whole thing going for a while.
Well, let's give some indication of what that meant for the Chinese people, because obviously most of the criticism of Mao's China today focuses on famines and deaths in famine. But as a direct consequence of this economic chaos, of the inability of the Chinese bourgeoisie to develop the economy, their inability to resolve the land question, to develop the rural economy, you had, for example, the Great Northwest Famine of 1928, which killed 6 million impoverished peasants. The death rates in China by 1930 was practically the highest in the world. It was 2.5 times that of the US and significantly more than India. And India at this point is under the Raj. And we've all heard the horrible statistics about the death by famine under British rule in India. So it's a real nightmare that Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese capitalists have created in China. So this is all the backdrop. You got on the one hand the crushing of the most advanced layers of the Chinese working class in 27 and the inability and unwillingness of the leaders of the Communist International who were advising the Chinese Communist Party to draw the correct lessons. You have this horrific, backward, corrupt and vicious regime of the Kuomintang, which is more interested in stamping out what remains of communism in China than it is with developing the economy and providing a decent existence to the Chinese people. And it's in this situation that you have the peasants' guerrilla struggle and the establishment of the rural Soviets that really lay the foundation for Mao's power base. So can we talk a little bit about who Mao Zedong actually was, what kind of layer of society he came out of, and what he was doing in this period?
Yeah, well, Mao was from a relatively well-to-do peasant family, and it's hard to sort of find out definitively what his views were before he joined the Communist Party and his role in the early Communist Party, because he was a relatively obscure figure. I mean, in the 1925 revolution, he was not a leading member of the Communist Party. He was on the Central Committee, so he was he would have been known, obviously, to a lot of people in the party, but he was not considered one of the leaders. He was a sort of junior leader, I suppose you could say. He was an organizer, actually, is what he was. He was not a theoretician or a political leader. He was an organizer, and particularly of peasants because of his peasant background. So although the revolution was in the 20s was led by the working class, and the Chinese Communist Party, of course, based itself on the working class in the cities, which was always the understanding from the beginning. There was never any idea that it was going to be a peasant party or peasant revolution. And the events in 1925 to 7 show that that was right, because those events were led by the working class. But nevertheless, they had a peasant wing, of course, rightly so. The peasants were the majority of society. And although there's not much evidence that Chinese peasantry was able to sort of lead a revolution or even at a local level, they obviously were very discontented, and they had many grievances against landlordism, and so naturally they were a certain ally of the working class, and it was right that the Communist Party would do work amongst the peasants as a sort of auxiliary to the main work, and Mao was responsible for that. And so when the revolution failed, and then, as we've described, collapsed, the Communist Party sort of fled into the countryside because of the inability, because of Stalin, the inability to acknowledge the defeat and to adjust and go into hiding and rebuild in the cities. They staged these adventures, basically, these uprisings, which were doomed to inevitable defeat, and had to flee in a completely chaotic fashion into the countryside. And in one of the places they fled to was the area that Mao was responsible for. So yeah, Mao was organising peasant work in the countryside in Henan province, I believe. And because of these failed uprisings, one of the failed uprisings that Stalin insisted that they do was in a nearby city, and they fled into Henan province essentially and into his areas. And so that didn't make him the leader of the Communist Party by any means, but it meant that he was playing at that moment in this very uncertain period a leading role in sort of corralling together these disparate forces of Communist Party members basically fleeing for their lives.
One thing that we should say about Mao is that owing to the nature of his experiences leading the peasant struggle, leading guerrilla warfare for years, but even prior to that, his own peasant background, it meant that he had a tendency to subordinate the political struggle to the practical necessity of the military struggle, right?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's necessary to say that there was no theoretical foresight on this. There was no, from Mao or anyone else, there was never an idea, even right up into the 1930s when they've been doing it for a while. It was never said, oh, the Chinese Revolution is actually a peasant revolution because it's a peasant country. And in fact, this is now our theory. We sort of modified Marxism. This was never said. The idea was always, this is a temporary reprieve and we'll go back into the cities. And the official leadership of the party remained in the cities in this time, even if the real bulk of the party and its work was in the countryside under Mao's effective leadership. So that's the first thing to understand. But of course, by sort of subconsciously, I suppose, or not explicitly, when you're carrying out day-to-day work in the survival in the countryside, that's obviously going to have an effect on your consciousness and your outlook. And also, Mao was not a theoretician. He was an organizer. He never had been a theoretician. In fact, he'd barely read any Marxist literature at all up until the mid-30s, which wasn't entirely his fault. I mean, being in the countryside in China at the time, there was very little access to Marxist literature. He couldn't read Russian or English or German or anything. There's very little that had even been translated into Chinese, and even of that, very little of it found its way into these remote areas. So it's not entirely his fault, but he hadn't read the literature. He didn't really know Marxist theory, apart from some rudimentary ideas of it. He was an organizer, and by all accounts, an effective one. Mm-hmm. And he knew the countryside well. But you have to picture this. When you're in first of all, because the reason they were in the countryside was not some idea that, oh, this is actually where the revolution will be, because it's a peasant country. That wasn't the idea. The idea was to survive. So if you're trying to survive and you're fleeing from a murderous regime, which is what it was, Chiang Kai-shek's regime, the logical thing to do is to go into the remotest areas. And that's indeed what they did. The first area they went to, I think it was called the Jinggangshan, and it was these barren hillsides, in a remote part of the southern China. Very, very poor, very unproductive. And why was that a good place to go to? Precisely because it was poor and barren, because it was an area that the government didn't care about, didn't have any real effective footprint in, It was just a sort of remote area that effectively was lawless, and there was lots of banditry there as well for the same reason. So that was where they went, and they fled at other points, and there's lots that we could go into. But they basically moved around the country, but always to these remote places. If there was a part of the countryside that did have a lot of class struggle, that did, have the peasants engaging in class struggle, it was in the much more productive parts of the country where exploitation was higher, where there was more landlordism. It wasn't in these remote areas. So it didn't make any sense from a theoretical point of view. If, the idea is this Sinicization of Marxism, here in China it's a peasant revolution or something, then why go to these incredibly barren places where there weren't even that many peasants?
Yeah, and I think that that's reflected in the fact that when they eventually move out the mountains and end up establishing the Jiang Jieshi Central Soviets in 1931. And this presented much more fertile conditions because there was a bigger population, first of all, and one with a deep hatred towards landlords, towards Chiang Kai-shek. And we should say, to their credit, the so-called rural Soviets that were established under Mao and what was becoming his peasant army, the policy that they held and the demands they raised and the way they organized connected with the genuine grievances and the genuine objectives of the peasants in that region. So in 1931, they proclaimed a land law, for example, which stated that all lands of the feudal landlords, gentry, militarists, and other big private landowners shall be subject to confiscation without any compensation whatever, irrespective of whether they themselves work their lands or rent them out on lease. The Soviets will distribute the confiscated lands amongst the poor and middle peasants. Hired farm hands and toiling labourers shall enjoy equal rights to land allotments irrespective of sex. Aged persons, orphans and widows who are not in a position to work and who have no relatives on whom to depend shall be given social relief by the Soviets. So on the basis of this quite advanced agrarian policy, the Soviets swell, and at a certain point there are effectively millions of people that are under the authority of this new power in the countryside. And that's a complete reflection, not of some long-term plan, as you say, not of some theoretical niche that Mao has discovered, but the simple fact that the Kuomintang is so rotten that the rural Soviets tapped into a genuine feeling on behalf of the rural masses. Yes.
However, to go back to what you were asking about originally was about Mao's outlook, basically, and then the connection between his outlook and the work that they were doing. What was fostered in these rural conditions for the party and with Mao was a sort of voluntarism, you could call it, a subjective outlook, an outlook that the revolution depends more on our willpower and our organization than on the logic, the objective sort of process of the class struggle. And so, yes, they did move, and there was some successes and some progressive policies, although a lot of it was more on paper than in reality.
Yeah, this is the point we should always make, that you can have the best program in the world, but it's a material reality as to whether you're able to carry it out, and that depends upon what's practically possible.
Yeah, they're isolated from the rest of the economy, from industry, from the cities. They couldn't just, they can say, oh, we'll give the land to the landless peasants and things like this and improve the conditions of the peasants. But it's difficult to do that when you don't have access to industrial goods and to consumer goods from the cities. So they remained quite reliant on merchants and landlords with connections to the cities, basically. So they couldn't go that far on it. Which is not, in a way, is not their fault. I mean, it's not that they were sort of subjectively right wing or something, but it's just that the mistake is to try and build socialism in a remote rural area. You can't do it. Anyway, but to go back to this question of the sort of mentality of Mao, they then had to flee that area because at a certain point, Chiang Kai-shek, precisely because it was actually a more important area, and they kind of caught wind on where the communists were and what they were doing. And it was a more important area, more populous, more productive area. So they had staged many sort of extermination campaigns on the Communist Party with increasing success. And actually also over time, some of the peasants began to turn against the communists, because you also have to understand that they were effectively occupying this land and they had to be fed. So they might be kind of giving concessions to the peasants and educating them and things like that. And that was welcome, and they did recruit many peasants. But at the same time, other peasants were a bit resentful at having to now feed all of these Communist Party activists.
Not only that, but the very presence of those activists mean they're under constant attack by the government.
And so some of them were turned against the communists, and that was one of the reasons that the attacks from the regime began to be more successful, because some of the local peasants started to side with the government. So they had to flee, and they went on the Long March, which was this incredibly dangerous year-long march from one side of the country to another. Incredible story, like amazing adventure and heroic stuff done, where they tricked the Kuomintang. They would march one way and then suddenly go back on themselves and march another way and do all these incredible feats to evade, the forces, the better equipped forces of the military. Has to be said, 90% of them died in the Long March.
Yeah.
And then the whole party nearly just was extinguished. So yes, incredible heroism. We have to sort of, recognize that, an amazing self-sacrifice and determination, but at the same time, quite nearly utterly disastrous. And anyway, think about this. In these conditions, how are you going to host a democratic congress of the party? How are you going to thrash out your perspectives for the class struggle? Which you want to do by, when you're a Communist Party, you have conferences and your activists and all your leading members and theoreticians come from around the country and they discuss and they debate, where is society going? Where's the class struggle going? You get reports from workers in struggle and things like that. And in that process, you come to a kind of an understanding of the needs of society, the needs of the class struggle, what slogans the party needs to adopt, and how to win over the working class in struggle, basically. But obviously you can't do that if you're fighting for survival, if you're constantly moving around the country. The local peasants obviously can exercise no democratic control over the party because it's moving all the time. And it's just not viable. When they did, so they had very few conferences, democratic conferences in this period. When they did have them, whole chunks of the party wouldn't be there. Like even a majority of the party couldn't be there because they were a different army in a different part of the country. Some parts of the Communist Party in this period, in the early 30s, didn't have any contact with one another. And I don't mean like branches, but like whole sizable chunks of the party had no contact with one another, literally for years. There was no means of communication between them. And there's no means to discuss ideas, and there's certainly no democratic accountability. You couldn't elect or kick out leaders. Mao got elected the leader of the party, I think, in 1935. He'd been effectively the leader for a while before then. But even that is up for dispute, because in that conference when he was elected leader, one of the armies of the Communist Party, which represented a big chunk of the party, was not able to attend. It might be that if they were there, he wouldn't have been elected leader. So, what does this mean? It means that the whole outlook of the party becomes dominated by a kind of military commandism and voluntarism, i.e., rather than basing yourself on an understanding that the class struggle is independent of the party, it has its own logic, and we as a party need to understand that and participate in it and adapt the right slogans to that independently existing class struggle. Instead of looking at things like that, you look at things in terms of our survival and what do we need to do, what kind of Herculean efforts do we need to make to fight the enemy and to survive, and where do we need to go in the country, what part of the country is going to be more fruitful for hiding out in or building. That becomes the whole mentality of it. And so the whole psychology of Mao and the leaders becomes one of, not of Marxist science, of understanding objectively society, but one of military, commandism, essentially.
There's a good line from Trotsky's Peasant War in China and the Proletariat, written in 1932, which I think captures that mentality rather effectively. The commanding stratum of the Chinese Red Army has no doubt succeeded in inculcating itself with the habit of issuing commands. The absence of a strong revolutionary party and of mass organizations of the proletariat renders control over the commanding stratum virtually impossible. The commanders and commissars appear in the guise of absolute masters of the situation, and upon occupying cities will be rather apt to look down from above upon the workers. The demands of the workers might often appear to them either inopportune or ill-advised, which I think more or less reflects the commandist, militarist outlook that was necessary for conducting a peasant war, a guerrilla struggle, but is completely inappropriate to organizing a political campaign to develop an economy on the lines of socialism and healthy workers' democracy. And that causes immense problems later down the line.
Famous quotation from Mao is, "All power grows out of the barrel of a gun." The more extended quote is all along those lines, in which he's basically saying, look, if we have guns, we can create socialism. That's essentially how he began to see it. We have to understand, again, he never really had a theoretical training in Marxism either. But after spending decades fighting in the countryside, this was the mentality. our own military organization can achieve wonders. Forget about the independent interests of the working class, the psychology of the working class, the mood of the working class, the tempo of economic crisis and things like that. Forget about that. If we can organize, even more detachments of heroic fighters, we can just make it all happen. Essentially, that's the outlook that they adopted.
It is the case that the peculiar character of the Chinese Revolution is dictated by war in a very significant way. And a major turning point in China comes with the invasion by Japan.
Yeah, when Japan invaded in the early 30s and then stepped up its invasion in 1937, and it began to take over vast swathes of the country, that in a sense rescued the Communist Party, because at the time it was being hounded out of its rural bases quite effectively now by the Kuomintang. But when Japan invaded, it obviously sort of distracted the government. Of course, suddenly they're being invaded by this very powerful imperialist power. And it also, in over the next period, it discredited massively the Kuomintang, and it boosted the Communist Party's credibility, because basically the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek effectively just capitulated to the Japanese, right? They didn't really organize any fight against them. They, as I said, they were a deeply corrupt party, and they always had, the Chinese capitalist class had always based itself on just being a middleman with foreign powers, but who were far stronger than they were economically. They hadn't had any real ideas of competing with the British or American capitalists, and now the Japanese. So their idea was, in the main, was just to sort of cooperate with the Japanese. In fact, Wang Jingwei, who was a rival Kuomintang leader to Chiang Kai-shek, in fact, one that the Communist Party had favoured earlier on, they thought he was to the left of Chiang Kai-shek, he actually became the puppet leader for the Japanese of the parts of China that were
Manchuria,
occupied. Well, and beyond, when they went beyond Manchuria. He became the puppet leader of that chunk of the country that was under Japanese occupation. So and they were seen in this way. They were seen as capitulators, as corrupt, as doing deals with the Japanese. Rather, their idea is, well, we can't defeat the Japanese, so we should just cooperate with them, make some money, essentially. And Chiang Kai-shek actually had a slogan: internal pacification first, external resistance second or afterwards. In other words, defeat the internal enemy, which he was obsessed with. His whole coming to power was defined by the struggle against the Communist Party, which he'd never quite managed to complete. So his idea was, no, we've got to get rid of these internal enemies first, and then maybe we can fight the Japanese.
And this
afterwards.
is at a time when China had lost to Japan about a fifth of her national territory, 40% of her railway mileage, 80% of her iron, 37% of the country's forest lands, and 40% of national export trade. Yeah. Japan controlled 75% of total pig iron and iron mining enterprises, and over half the textile industry. And we should also say that the character of the imperial Japanese regime at this point was horrific. Yeah, it was a fascist regime.
Yeah, it was obviously, it was incredibly brutal. And despised, obviously, widely within China, absolutely despised. And the Communist Party was very, to its credit, was always, saying we have to fight the Japanese. Didn't do much fighting the Japanese itself because it wasn't in a position to, but it was known for saying that. And so it gained enormous credibility and support in the eyes of Chinese people, both in the cities and the countryside, for that reason. Whereas the regime that was trying to, everyone knew the regime was more interested in exterminating the communists than the Japanese. So the regime was seen as national traitors, basically.
Rightly so. Unfortunately, the position of the Communist Party, along with the policy of the Communist International, which by this point it had its fingers burned because it had moved in a absurdly ultra-left direction with the third period and was moving towards the so-called Popular Front in an opportunist direction, trying to forge alliances with imperialist powers, with the democratic bourgeois against fascism. Yeah. It gave the instruction to the Chinese communists to find common ground with Chiang Kai-shek. Is it true to say that at one point the communists had Chiang Kai-shek? He was kidnapped.
In late 1936 or early 1937, he was kidnapped by his own troops. So despised was he, right, for the reasons I've said. So his own troops were saying, you're not fighting the Japanese. We want to fight the Japanese. So they actually, some of his troops mutinied and captured him and handed him over to the Communist Party. I think probably expecting the Communist Party to kill him. And to sort of lead this national fight back.
Which we should say they would have been totally within their rights to do. The guy was a war criminal and a mass murderer.
And despite having, their great enemy in their hands, defenseless, they basically did a deal with him, which, at gunpoint, which they didn't even extract many concessions out of him, really, at all. And it was just a verbal agreement. But basically they said, look, we want to fight Japan. You need to fight Japan. Stop fighting us. Let's do a deal. You stop fighting us and we will cooperate our forces in the struggle against Japan, which they thought was a realistic policy and looked good because it looked like they were being prepared to unite. And we should say that the idea they had at the time, which was expressed in Mao's famous document on contradiction, but it reflected the general Comintern policy, was of national struggle, basically the cancellation or the pausing of class struggle internally, but for national reasons. The idea was, look, if you've got a foreign invader and war, then that becomes the key question. That becomes the primary contradiction, as Mao called it. And all the other ones, the class contradictions, are relegated or paused. So basically you have national unity because everyone hates the foreigner, basically.
And it wasn't national unity in a superficial sense. You had Kuomintang officers invited to Soviet bases, to Chinese Communist Party bases. You had pictures of Marx and Chiang Kai-shek held up in party buildings. And there was a public declaration that the Communist Party was abandoning its policy, I quote, of overthrowing the Kuomintang by force and the movement of Sovietization. It discontinues its policy of forcible confiscation of land from landlords, abolishes the present Soviet governments, and practices democracy based on the people's rights in order to unify the national political power. And Mao was not an oppositional force in this turn, in this United Fronts.
He embraced it, and it might seem to the outside as a reasonable thing. Oh yeah, you're being invaded. Why would you continue fighting internally, some sort of civil war or something, when you've got an external invader? Yeah, sure. That is, of course, that becomes the defining question: the foreign invader. We agree, and the struggle against that invader does become the key question. But is it better to carry out that struggle against the invader by allying with facilitators and capitulators to that invader, who, as I said, his position was internal pacification first, external resistance second. In other words, kill the communists first. And unsurprisingly, that was borne out, right? Although they formally allied in 1937, after then, Chiang Kai-shek did no real fighting against the Japanese. His idea was just to rely on the Americans. The Americans would fight the Japanese for us. And we'll get weapons from the Americans, which they did. The Americans gave them weapons to help them fight against Japan. But we'll just sort of stockpile those weapons to use them against the communists later. Or even sometimes they did actually. I think in 1941 or 2, there was an incident in which they attacked the Communist Party with those weapons. They just were not interested in fighting foreign imperialism and never had been. They saw it as too risky, as too difficult and dangerous. And at the end of the day, those were capitalists. Of course, Chinese capitalists would rather be top dog. But if there's an overwhelmingly more powerful capitalist in your country, the capitalist instinct is just to make money out of it. It's not to be some sort of heroic patriot. So that was their whole attitude. And you got to remember, the Communist Party wasn't just a party with some members. It was a party that had led a revolution only a few years before. It occupied chunks of the country with arms. From the capitalist point of view, that's intolerable. Do you think the British capitalist class, what would their attitude to be if chunks of the country were occupied by an armed Communist Party? No matter how much that Communist Party said, no, we want to collaborate with you. They would not. They would want to exterminate it. They would not accept lack of sovereignty over chunks of the country controlled by a party that called itself communist and was allied to a communist international. They just wouldn't accept it. And of course that was the case. So it was naive to think that you could have some genuine unity in the fight against the Japanese. And that proved to be the case. And there's so many other things we could go into, even ignoring their political attitude towards the Communist Party, the extreme brutality and corruption and the exploitative nature of the capitalist class in China meant that the way in which they recruited people, for example, to their army, it just meant they could never effectively fight the Japanese because they were so demoralized. They would just like march into villages and just round up peasants by tying a rope around their necks and march them naked from one side of the country to another where the barracks would be, giving them no real food. And it's estimated that about half of these recruits just died on the way, you know, starving and diseased. These people and these peasants, they hated the regime, you know, so they were totally ineffective at fighting the Japanese anyway.
Well, not only that, but the complete disregard by the so-called nationalist party towards the vast majority of Chinese people. You see, for example, in the Yellow River incident in Kaifeng in 1938, where in order to halt the Japanese advance, because Chiang's army was retreating, which it often did, because it was rotten and poorly led, because he also tended to stuff the ranks of the general staff with his friends and confidants and cronies. They deliberately flooded about 5,000 villages, left 2 million homeless, and contributed to a famine that killed millions of Chinese peasants. And then after that defeat, the Chinese forces under Chiang Kai-shek's regime retreated in such a way to give the Japanese open access to Nanjing, which lays the basis for the infamous rape of Nanjing on the 13th of December 1937, in which about 300,000 civilians were massacred. There were mass rapes. It's an incident of just indescribable horror. I don't think I can even go over some of the details on an uncensored podcast. But you can imagine, given this policy, given this completely debased way in which the Kuomintang conducted the war against Japan, more often than not conducting it at all, that the attitude of the peasant masses, well, the whole of China, including the intellectual layers and the middle classes towards the regime, would have been one of immense anger and hatred. And as you say, because it's only the Communist Party that appear to be putting up a fight, it inevitably promotes their image and wins them a degree of authority.
Yeah, even in spite of their formal line, which was one of allying with the Kuomintang and sort of saying, oh, we'll give up our bases and we'll give up our independence because it's this national struggle. Despite them bending over backwards to appease the Kuomintang and to appear reasonable, it was never understood that way either by the Kuomintang or by the people. At the end of the day, most Chinese people, what they saw was there's a communist party. It's hated, but it's attacked by our government. And it's calling for a fight against the Japanese, which our government has never really done. So in the eyes of people, this party was independent of and opposed to the government, was a revolutionary party, really, despite the policies they actually were professing. And that's why, in a way, that might seem to justify it all, because at the end of the day, they still won that support. But it's in spite of the position that they adopted, and it only really adds to the point that they should have openly fought for revolution, basically, and openly denounced the regime rather than allying with it.
And really what's decisive in resulting in Japan's retreat from Manchuria, retreat from China, is not the combined military struggle of the Communist Party and the Kuomintang. It's the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the collapse of the Japanese war effort in general. And in the aftermath of that, let's talk about Stalin's role, because Stalin tries to sell out the Communist Party because he regards the Kuomintang as a more likely pragmatic inheritor of the political leadership of the country after the war.
After the war, Stalin essentially continued to negotiate as a sort of diplomat with Chiang Kai-shek over the heads of the Communist Party. So he would do deals with Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party didn't know about it. He would treat him as the legitimate ruler of China. He wasn't really interested in the Communist Party, especially also because it should be said that Mao was a bit like Tito in the sense that he kind of had his own base of support because of this unusual way that the party had developed by going into the countryside. Although he didn't oppose that, it meant that the party sort of developed its own, it was very isolated. Didn't have any real contact with Moscow. And Stalin's favoured leader of the Communist Party was a guy called Wang Ming, because he knew him, because he'd actually been to Russia and spent time there. He was a stooge, basically, of Stalin. and he lived in, I think, in Shanghai or in a city, and he was his man. But Wang Ming had no real support within the Chinese Communist Party. It was all with Mao, because Mao led the struggle in the countryside, which is where they all were. And so that meant that, from Stalin's point of view, Mao was someone not under his control, who he didn't really know. And Chiang Kai-shek was a guy he could understand, he could relate to as a sort of world leader. After the Second World War, of course, China also was put on the Security Council of the UN. The reason that China is one of the 5 countries on the UN Security Council goes back to the aftermath of the Second World War, because the victors were seen basically as Britain, France, America, Russia, and China. Those were the main participants in the belligerents in the war on the winning side. So although China was incredibly weak in comparison to all those other countries just mentioned, it was of course a very large country, and it had, the idea was also, by putting it on the Security Council, it was an ally of America, and it would become an important country, and it was sort of an important linchpin of American forces in an important part of the world. So it was now on this Security Council. Chiang Kai-shek basically was the leader of this power on the Security Council. So in Stalin's eyes, that's a serious man. That's important. The Communist Party, I don't really know them. They're not under my control. They've been doing this thing in the countryside. It's just Stalin didn't take it seriously, and he did not believe that at all that there could be a revolution. I mean, he never had that attitude towards China anyway, as I've mentioned. But on top of that, the Communist Party at this stage was, once again, it was in the countryside, and it was massively outgunned by the Kuomintang, who were in power, and the Americans had armed to the teeth in the struggle against Japan. And now the Americans sort of basically saw its task was to finally finish off with the communists in the countryside. So they gave it all this weaponry, and it also inherited quite a bit of weaponry from the Japanese. So from Stalin's point of view, that was the serious government. It was much better armed than the Communist Party, and it was in power. And the Communist Party seemed a fairly obscure force in the countryside. He just really had no idea, I think, that within a few years they would actually be coming to power.
And that happens in part because with the Japanese invasion finally repelled, the last prop that Chiang Kai-shek could use for his regime, this question of national defense and also the excuse of the pressure of the Japanese occupation, was gone. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, there's obviously a huge amount of suffering, there's a huge amount of economic dislocation, and Chiang Kai-shek resumes his civil war with the Communist Party, I think in 1947. Yes,
the Communist Party, although they had justified their truce, their alliance with the Kuomintang on the grounds of the Japanese invasion, they actually proposed to continue that truce after Japan was defeated, which doesn't make any sense. But that's from a political point of view. But that they obviously didn't feel ready to fight. They didn't feel confident that they could defeat the Kuomintang. So they said, "Oh yeah, just allow us to kind of continue in our bases, and we won't fight you," which again is naive to think that the Kuomintang would allow, chunks of the country to be run by an armed communist party. It's just naive. So the Kuomintang broke the truce in 1947. So again, the class struggle, if you like, the initiative was taken by the reactionary side, and that forced the Communist Party, of course, to fight for its own survival. Its position was not a very revolutionary position. Its program was also called New Democracy. Its idea was not that there would be a revolution and that capitalism would be abolished at all. It didn't have that perspective. It thought that was unrealistic. It thought that capitalism had barely even begun in China. So their position was that there should be a coalition government of sort of progressive forces, including the bourgeoisie, excluding only that chunk of the bourgeoisie which had collaborated with Japan. That was the idea. And it was a proposal to the Kuomintang. It wasn't an announcement to the population. It wasn't like a propaganda thing to the Chinese masses. We're fighting for democracy. It was rather directed towards the Kuomintang. Look, if you read it, that's how it's written. It's written like for the Kuomintang leaders. It's not an appeal to the masses. And it's basically, look, do a deal with us. We'll have a coalition government. Don't try and exterminate us. We're very reasonable. Let's have a joint government, a kind of democratic government of rejuvenation of China. And we'll establish capitalism, not communism, capitalism, because we need to have a period of that. And the idea is to sort of have a kind of modernization program of a kind of democratic modern China, basically, but a capitalist one. That was the idea. But it was made impossible because they were attacked by the Kuomintang. So they ended up having to fight in a sort of a life or death struggle, a militant struggle, quite literally, with the government. And that developed a logic of its own. Because the government was so corrupt and hated and inept, basically, it managed to squander all of its advantages. It used terrible tactics. And, its own troops hated it. And so it started losing, and the Communist Party started winning all the battles, and the momentum went with them, and it carried them all the way into power. So they ended up having a government to themselves, despite their own perspective.
Well, on the run-up to that, aside from the military victories, there was also the social situation in the country. So in 1936, there had been 278 strikes and labour disputes recorded across the entire country. By comparison, in 1946, so the year just before the breaking of the truce by the Kuomintang, there was a total of 1,716 strikes in Shanghai alone. And in 1947, the number of that city reached 2,538. So the whole country at this point was on the cusp of a revolutionary explosion. There was utter hatred towards the Kuomintang in all layers. I mean, you talk about the hollowing out of the armed forces. Obviously, the peasantry hated the Kuomintang, but the working class was also reacting against the regime. The middle classes as well. There was a big clampdown on the universities. The students were being heavily repressed, accused of being communists. The intellectuals were opposed to the regime. There was no layer of Chinese society that didn't hate Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang.
Massive inflation, which completely eroded the living standards of the middle class. So they were really hated it. There was huge strike waves, which the Communist Party could have based itself on. That's the point, right? The idea that, China's a rural country, so the only way they could have come to power is through that. That's Mao's genius. But actually, not only in the 1920s was there a working class-led revolution, but in the 1940s and in the run-up to taking power, there were massive strikes and massive student movements that shook the whole country. The workers were actually potentially quite powerful, but the Communist Party had no real contact with them. In fact, throughout the whole period they're in the countryside, right up into taking power, when the Communist Party recruited people in the cities, which of course they did, some people would want to join, they would send those people. They wouldn't say to those people, okay, go and build in the city. No, they sent those people into the countryside because they needed help there in their struggle for survival. So they never really re-established a base amongst the workers, even though they could have done. So when these strikes took place, the Communist Party had nothing really to do with it. And there's that quotation from Trotsky you said earlier where he said, when they come into the cities, the Communist Party will be rather apt to look down on the workers and see their independent movements, their strikes and such, as, inopportune, as sort of a bit of a nuisance because it's not under their control. It's not how they would want it. That was their attitude. They didn't see this, look, we're trying to come to power. And there's all these strikes. You'd think they might issue a call for a general strike, help us bring down this rotten regime in a revolutionary manner, and let's ride the wave of that. They never said that. They never issued a call for a general strike. They never appealed to the working class to help them. Their idea was to come to power on their own military basis, essentially, which of course they did, right? And they did conduct that struggle quite fantastically from a technical military point of view. They fought brilliantly. They had fantastic tactics. They knew the countryside very well. They also offered land to soldiers that would defect from the Kuomintang, because obviously those soldiers were generally drawn from the peasantry. So they said, look, you suffered under landlordism. If you join our army, you will get a plot of land, your own plot of land, because that's what we stand for. That was obviously the correct tactic. It was a very good demand to have, and it did win. One of the reasons they won the civil war is there were a lot of defections from the military, from the Kuomintang to the Communist Party. So they did some amazing, carried out some amazing work in the countryside and a military level. But they could have, I believe, ridden to power on the basis of the working class. And that would have meant not only that the military struggle potentially could have been avoided, but it would have meant that the regime they would have established could have had real workers' democracy as its basis, and factory occupations run by the workers. But they didn't come to power on that basis, so that wasn't there.
And we're not fetishizing the idea of workers' democracy as a moral question. The point is, without workers' democracy, you can't effectively plan an economy. And even though there was a huge growth in the Chinese economy on the basis of economic planning, there was also a huge amount of waste and irrationality. I mean, attempts to just by decree develop like smelting furnaces out in the countryside in order to increase the production of iron. This commandist approach to planning the economy, rather than letting the working class from below tell you what is necessary, what's required in this sector, what kind of support and investment is required in that sector. Many of the same problems that you saw in the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact. But just to bring this discussion about the revolution itself to a close, Chiang Kai-shek finally gives up and flees to Taiwan, taking, I believe, $300 million worth of gold and a big chunk of China's artistic treasures with him, and establishes a new regime, which exists to this day. But I wanted to, in bringing this discussion to an end, return to that article that I began with by Ted Grants, because I think it's amazingly prophetic, bearing in mind this is written before the final defeats of Chiang Kai-shek, and certainly before Mao fully establishes his control over the country. And he writes, like the regimes in Eastern Europe, Mao will look to Russia as his model, and undoubtedly tremendous economic progress will be achieved, but the masses, both workers and peasants, will find themselves enslaved by the bureaucracy. He also goes on to predict some decade and a half in advance the Sino-Soviet splits. He says it's quite likely that Stalin will have a new Tito on his hands. The shrewder capitalist commentators are already speculating on this, although they derive cold comfort from it. Mao will have a powerful base in China, with its 500 million population and potential resources, and the undoubted mass support of his regime will possess in the early stages. So he begins to recognize the narrow nationalist perspective of the bureaucracy, combined with Mao's comparable strength, ability to chart an independent course, would result in the clash with Moscow, which of course did happen eventually. But I think that this is what strikes me when I read your articles about China, and when I look at the course that revolution took, the peculiar course that it took. It feels like a confirmation of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution in a very unusual way, because evidently the Chinese bourgeois were incapable of developing the economy. They were completely enthralled to imperialism. They exhibited all the characteristics of the capitalist class in the backward and dominated nations that Trotsky describes, all the way back to 1904, 1905. And as a result, other classes have to do the job for them. And because the working class was smashed in 1927 and the Communist Party cut off, in the end, the impetus for the development of China comes from a peasant army basically invading from the countryside, seizing the cities, and ultimately moving towards the establishment of a planned economy and expropriating capitalism without the intention of even doing that. I mean, I think Mao said that there had to be 100 years of capitalist development before you could talk about socialism in China. So can we just end by talking about this? Why is it, in the end, Mao needed to expropriate capitalism in China? And is this a fair conclusion that what you're seeing is a very peculiar illustration of the correctness of the permanent revolution? Well,
what the permanent revolution states is that the working class, although it's relatively small and the economy is not that developed, the working class does have the numerical and political strength in these countries to lead a revolution and even take power. And they're the only class that has an interest in doing so. But of course, because they're small and weak, they won't actually be able then to build socialism. They'll need help from advanced capitalist countries, which is exactly what, was the development of Russia. And so in China, that was basically the situation. But as you said, the working class wasn't able to do that. It was defeated. The Communist Party's leadership was wrong. Normally, that would then mean you just have a failed revolution, right? But because of the very peculiar set of circumstances. The communists fleeing into the countryside where, by all accounts, they should have really just failed, right? And they did, like I said, 90% of them were killed in the Long March. Like, they were very close to being snuffed out. And I think if Japan hadn't invaded, they probably would have been destroyed by the Kuomintang, and that would have been the end of it. But Japan invaded, and the whole of the Second World War created this very peculiar situation where the scale of destruction was so vast. Whole bourgeoisies and bourgeois states were sort of largely destroyed. In Eastern Europe, that was effectively the case. And that was sort of the case in China as well. The bourgeoisie, where Japan took over, the bourgeoisie was just totally dominated by Japan, completely discredited. Country was bled dry. So the Chinese state, after all of this, was sort of incredibly weak, right? Just like it was in these Eastern European countries. And for these reasons of war, you have the viability, the continued existence of the Communist Party as a sort of surprisingly powerful guerrilla force. So it creates an unusual set of circumstances in which they are able to come to power by military means alone, which almost has never ever happened anywhere else. The only other place really is Cuba and kind of Vietnam as well, for sort of quite similar reasons. But everywhere else, it's just not been possible at all. And guerrilla movements have been just destroyed and wiped out. But yeah, so that does happen. And what that leads to is a sort of momentum to the movement, which is beyond the intentions of the leaders. As you said, the capitalists who they wanted to ally with, really, they fled to Taiwan. As I keep on saying, they never trusted the Communist Party, no matter how much the Communist Party bent over backwards. In the eyes of the Chinese capitalists, this was a Communist Party. It was allied to the Soviet Union, which had abolished capitalism. It was armed as well. It was fighting the bourgeois government. They just never thought that this was something we could trust. So they didn't trust it, and they were defeated. So they fled to Taiwan, taking stuff with them. So there wasn't really a capitalist class in China. Obviously, here or there were capitalists, but it was incredibly weak.
Yeah, you could say that Mao was trying to form an alliance with the shadow of the bourgeoisie that evaporated the second he tried to grasp it.
And again, global war and global kind of struggle, and revolution basically altered the internal development, because he was in the early 50s, he was still trying to sort of pursue this policy of kind of balancing between the classes and not actually abolishing capitalism. But then he had the Korean War right on its doorstep, which again is a product of the sort of fallout of the Second World War and Japan's invasion and then Japan's defeat, creating this vacuum. And then so you have this war, which America then intervenes in, and the Soviet Union and China intervene in. And that, again, it heightens, obviously, the struggle. It's the beginning of the Cold War as well. And of course, Chinese capitalists sided with the capitalists in Korea and saw that as a way to sort of maybe drive out the communists, right? That if the capitalists in Korea won, if the Korean War was just completely finished in favor of the capitalists and the Americans, the Chinese capitalists hoped that might bring them back to power. So they're collaborating on that side, and that's intolerable for the Chinese regime. And basically, they begin to therefore sort of start expropriations, of capitalists to defend the regime, essentially, against these capitalists who are collaborating with the Americans. And so the whole international logic of events forces the logic of events in China down the roads of expropriation of this very, very weak bourgeoisie anyway. It was not really capable of running industry. So throughout the 50s, you basically you have this situation where the regime, basically, you could say, it kind of moves to the left. Mm-hmm. It expropriates capitalism. And there's another reason for it as well, which is that arguably once they'd come to power, they weren't sure of themselves. They were trying to establish a regime. And if they had immediately moved to abolish capitalism and sort of base themselves on the workers, that would have carried, from their point of view, the danger of arousing the working class and, things getting out of hand, out of their control, which they didn't want. They wanted to be cautious. And by this time, by the mid-50s, they had sort of settled things down a bit. They'd gotten more of a handle on the situation. And I think they also felt like, well, now we can sort of move to the left and sort of appeal to the workers, which they did. they appealed to the workers, but they didn't want the workers to sort of take actual control into their hands. That was the danger from there. They didn't want genuine workers' control, genuine workers' democracy, which they wouldn't have control over. But by the mid-50s, they felt, okay, we can nationalize these factories, and we've got our systems in place, we've got our apparatus in place to do it under our control. So they sort of maneuvered between the classes as well. So there's an element of that, and yeah, by the mid-50s, they've like abolished capitalism within China, and there's the beginnings of a planning of the economy, which initially was enormously successful.
Yeah, I have some stats here to illustrate that. You mentioned life expectancy. The numbers I have here are that life expectancy rose from 36 years in 1949 to 57 years in 1957. The proportion of children attending primary school doubled to 50%. The quality and quantity of urban housing improved. The rights of women were extended and protected in law, exemplified, as you mentioned, by the abolition of feet binding. Now, again, we should bear in mind that what's written on paper is only carried out insofar as that it's materially possible, and not all of these things were preserved, and there were many problems as well. But it's undeniable that the Chinese Revolution broke the impasse of backwardness that China had been enslaved by for years and years and years. That laid the basis for a tremendous development of the Chinese economy, tremendous modernization of China's society. It was a profoundly progressive event in history, which came with many conquests for the working class and the peasantry.
Yeah, there was very rapid economic growth and modernization, which is never discussed, never admitted now.
So just to bring this discussion to a close, we celebrate the accomplishments of the Chinese Revolution. We regard it as a great event in the history of the class struggle, and we salute the immense heroism of the Chinese peasants and workers who defeated not only the Kuomintang, but also put up the only serious fight against Japanese imperialism and laid the basis for China being a rival power to US imperialism today. But we mentioned that the nature of the regime that took over, what we would describe as a deformed worker state, resulted in certain contradictions. And I wonder if you, in summing up, to illustrate our kind of balanced attitude, our complex celebration of the Chinese Revolution, whether you could explain a little bit about how those contradictions express themselves.
Yeah, well, as you said, workers' democracy is not a moral question. It's not, oh, that's nice. It's so enlightened to have that, so we should have it. It's because you can't build socialism without it. You can't build it without democratic control and accountability. And I think that's borne out by those events. So although incredible economic achievements were made, huge growth, modernization, improvements in working class conditions, that there's a limit to that, and also there's enormous costs in the way it was done. I've also mentioned how in the countryside, Mao adopted a very commandist and non-Marxist attitude, that the society and the class struggle and the economy doesn't necessarily have a logic of its own that is ultimately decisive. It's more that, like, well, our own heroism and determination can achieve wonders, and that was carried through by when they took power. As Trotsky said, upon taking power or coming into the cities, they will look down on the workers and see them as this sort of nuisance in a way. And that was the case, right? They had come to power through their own efforts, not through the workers. And then, of course, on top of that, they also looked to Stalin's Russia as a model. And so their outlook is like, well, we're going to build socialism here. Well, initially, of course, they had the idea of capitalism. But when they moved towards that, they had the idea that, look, we can just build this through commands, through our own willpower, as was Mao's experience in the countryside. And it did lead to some, as much as they did achieve some incredible things, it also led to some incredible disasters, very serious ones. In particular, I'll just mention one, the Great Leap Forward, which began in the late 50s. And the idea was we've now abolished capitalism. And Mao suddenly kind of gets a bee in his bonnet, if you like, about suddenly, we're going to build socialism now, and we're just going to do it. And they basically had forced collectivization, like in Russia, which of course was disastrous there, but they didn't learn the lesson of that. And they essentially ordered all of the peasants, which is about 500 million people, it's a lot of people, to abandon their plots of land, their individual plots of land, which for many of them, these were new conquests, right? They had been exploited by landlords before. Now, thanks to the revolution, they've got their land. That's a big gain for them. They're very proud probably of it, and they've worked very hard to cultivate that land. And they're suddenly ordered by the new regime to give that up and enter these collective farms about which they know nothing, they don't understand. This is not something that comes out of their own movement, their own struggle. It's something the government is dictating to them. And so they don't do it. They don't trust it, right? But the government basically forces them at gunpoint to do that. And it led to, just like in Russia, it led to vast numbers of peasants sabotaging it, refusing to cooperate and not, sowing seeds, burning crops, slaughtering livestock or eating it, as a sort of protest or to sort of keep bits of their land that they were being made to abandon. So the peasantry isn't a class that you can just order about. You can order like a detachment of soldiers, but you can't order 500 million peasants to do something that isn't in their interests. It just won't work. In the same way, you can't order this economy to be twice as big as it is, no matter how powerful a ruler you are. But also, of course, the other reason that it didn't work is not just because the peasants didn't want it, but although collectivization is correct and it is the progressive thing for agriculture, there's an economic foundation for it. It's not just a good idea that you can just put in whenever you like. You need things like tractors, combine harvesters, mass-produced fertilizer, because you're not growing crops on the basis of one or two peasants on a plot of land with like a couple of implements. You've got a big plot of land, you've got collective work, so you need the right implements for that, the right technology. And they didn't have it. That wasn't there. So they sort of ordered everyone to farm in this way without the actual technological basis for it. And of course, also for that reason, it was a disaster. And so literally millions died. And then they reversed course. They realized it was a mistake. But that's another reason why that shows why you can't plan an economy in that top-down dictatorial fashion. Because although you do need a plan, to run a planned economy, you do need a plan that's coordinated and drawn up, and is the whole country or even the whole of the world, if you've got international social, needs to cooperate with that plan. You'll make mistakes, right? Hopefully not as big a mistake as this, but you'll make mistakes, and those mistakes need to be corrected. So you need to have democratic control. You need to have the ability to criticize and to remove people. And they didn't have that in China. So all these peasants opposing it, and other people in the party who could see it was a mistake, couldn't oppose it, right? They couldn't actually criticize and remove people and change the policy, although it was eventually changed because it was so disastrous. So yes, China achieved incredible things in that period, but there were also enormous disasters. And eventually the growth did run out of steam for the same reasons in Russia. You can achieve some things with a kind of commandist planned economy. Some basic, heavy industry can be built and things like that. But eventually the economy becomes too complex and you just can't dictate to it in that top-down way. You need democratic control, checks and balances from below, from the working class. And without that sort of initiative and incentive from the workers, they don't have any say in it. They will begin to stop being enthusiastic about it. It was particularly clear in Russia. So the economy began to stop growing, and that's why they basically returned to capitalism. But that's another podcast, I think.
Well, as a matter of fact, we did another podcast on the question of whether China is communist, which I'll link in the description, also with Daniel. And yeah, just to end by returning to this article I quoted at the beginning, we don't deny that there were famines and there were millions of deaths under Mao's China, but it wasn't because they were too communist. It wasn't because they were too radical. On the contrary, it was as a result of the fact that they didn't lay the foundations for building genuine communism. And now in China, the legacy of those errors is the restoration of capitalism. Well, I think that's all we have time for this week. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll see you all for a new episode on the Spectre of Communism podcast next week.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.